Hello everyone, I'm Alex Antonio, I'm a physiotherapist and you are watching my YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about the pelvic floor. Where is the pelvic floor? The pelvic floor is situated at the floor of your pelvis, hence why it gets that name. However, I don't like to think of it as a floor structure because floor you think of something hard, and the pelvic floor isn't hard. Those muscles in there are not hard. They're actually more like a trampoline. A trampoline can descend, it can come up, and it bounces either way. It's got flexibility and strength within both directions. You can also think of it like a hammock that supports and descends but can also come up to bring you out the hammock. So where do they go from and to? They go from the back of the pelvis to the front, but they also go from side to side. So it's really important to think about those structures whenever we're dealing with releasing them, that we're not dealing with just one clump of a situation, we're dealing with them going from front to back and side to side. But what do they do? What's their job? Well, they do a number of things, and one of those things is supporting your internal organs. So from above, you'll have your bowels, your stomach, your liver, spleen, everything is coming down with gravity. And the job of the pelvic floor is to oppose that pressure. So if you get a change in your abdominal pressure, these guys have to adjust. A bit like if I were to do a back bend, my abdominal pressures would change and these guys would have to adjust. And you can actually see an example of this in some high athletes that do things like gymnastics. And sometimes if their pelvic floor is quite tight, they've trained it to be quite tight and they've maybe not lengthened it enough, they go into a back flip and they can end up weeing themselves. And it's because this pelvic floor is not strong in that new range that they've adjusted there, and they're sitting with tight muscles that are not able to flex and be diverse to protect and adjust to the changes of the bladder. And it's not that they've had a baby or some weird surgery or anything like that. It's literally to do with pressure and whether the muscles are tight and not able to adjust to that new pressure. There's some other interesting functions they have, and that's to do with sexual function. They're really important in helping to bring an actual pleasurable situation. They deal with sensation and they deal with function to do with intercourse. They also work with your deep back muscles and your abdominal muscles and also your diaphragm together to support your spine. So there's quite a number of functions that they have. And if you think about how they work with the spine, the diaphragm, and the different pressures, they actually have to adapt to when you go to move and pick something up. When you go to pick something up, your abdominal pressure changes again, and they have to adjust. And without them, things are going to descend. And finally, they're really important in the control of your bladder and your bowel. So they control what happens through your urethra here when you wee, but also with your anus. So what happens to these pelvic floor muscles during pregnancy? The muscles actually lengthen and they adjust again to those pressure changes from above. But also they respond to the hormone levels that change. You have more of the relaxin hormone, which again makes all your ligaments and your muscles more supple. So this is already happening at first. Then when it comes to birth, these muscles have to really lengthen to allow baby to come through. Now this pelvis is actually a male pelvis. So what I'm going to show you is a female pelvis. You see the difference? There's a pretty big difference, right? So The female pelvis is much wider and hence has the ability to have a baby to come through. Whereas sometimes when I show this one, people are thinking, oh my goodness, how's anything going to get through there? And that's the reason why. So with the female pelvis, it's much wider to allow that. But also this model shows us nicely how the body can move, how the bones move with the laxity that happens within the ligaments. Obviously they don't fall out as bad as this, but they begin to relax and they begin to expand. And what happens here is that this bone comes outward, again to allow even more space. Yeah. And sometimes you can find this on photos of birth where a lady might be on her front on all fours or hanging on this edge of the bed, and you can actually see this happen. So here in the pelvis, this is the back, this is the front. Now we think of a pelvis as being in this position, but actually in fact it sits at more of an angle like this. So think of a soup bowl and being slightly tipped forward. Now when you add pregnancy to that, you've got the big belly here with the baby coming forward. That draws your pelvis even more forward, which can then make your back arch and tighten through the muscles at the front. This then puts your pelvic floor in not the best position, not the position it's most optimum in. So what we look for is to actually keep the pelvis slightly back a bit, just so you're in that slight tilt, but you're not in this really forward tilt. Now when you've had the baby, it's very typical that your posture can end up being the same. So you've had baby, this is all deflated, but your pelvis is still hanging quite forward. So one of the simple things you can do to activate your pelvic floor, to get it just to wake up as soon as you've given birth, is to just tuck your tailbone under. So imagining you've got a little train at the end of your tailbone and you're going from your tailbone to your pubic bone, and he's got a little train track there and he's going, yeah. So you're just tucking that tailbone under just slightly, and that will bring those pelvic floor muscles into a much better position. So during pregnancy, the pelvic floor muscles adapt. And then during birth, particularly at the crowning point, which is when the baby's head is coming through, these muscles will lengthen to their optimum to allow baby through. And that's a natural process. That's something that will happen and happens quite naturally. But what can we do to optimize that? Well, people will be thinking, should I do pelvic floor muscles then? Pelvic floor exercises? Yeah, you should do them. The reason being is because you bring more blood flow to the area. So think about chewing gum. If you've got a piece of chewing gum, you've chewed it and you put it on the side and then you leave it. You leave it for 9 months. Go and put that piece of chewing gum back in your mouth. What do you think will happen? It's going to be it's going to be solid, right? So imagine those pelvic floor muscles as a bit like chewing gum. If you haven't done anything with them, if you haven't exercised them, maybe even haven't even had intercourse, then that means they will be a bit sticky, a bit tight, and maybe even a bit dry. And so doing your pelvic floor exercises will contract them and bring blood flow to the area, make them flexible, and this will actually optimize your birth. So let's talk about pelvic floor exercises. We touched on it a little bit earlier with bringing your pelvis into a backwards tilt. So it's tucked under. This gives the pelvic floor a better optimized position. But also what you want to think about doing is relaxing your tummy muscles and relaxing your bum muscles as you do this. Because most people, when I say to them to do a pelvic tilt, they'll tighten their bum muscles. But what we want to do is just concentrate on just the pelvic muscles doing that and a little bit of the lower abdominals, but not the big tummy muscles and not the big bum muscles. Okay, so amongst Kegel exercises, which you've probably heard before, there are also things that you can do that are dynamic exercises that adjust to pressures. We talked about it again before, about how your pelvic floor adjusts to different pressures. So if you've got more pressures coming from above, then pelvic floor will tighten and adjust to that pressure change. Once you're out of an acute phase, so after the sort of 6-week mark, then after giving birth, then you can start to do a little bit of dynamic exercises. And these were studied against Kegel exercises, and they found they strengthen the pelvic floor just as well. And when you think about it, these functional movements are things that you're going to be doing day to day. You need to be able to bend over to pick your baby up, to be able to put your car seat in the car. There's a number of things that are functional that actually can strengthen the pelvic floor. And if we get the pelvis in the right position, the pelvic floor will respond in the right way. Some of those exercises include low-level jumping, wide base squats, bridging with resistance bands around the knees. There's a number of things that actually stimulate and create the pressure there to give you the strength in the pelvic floor. So then we can go back onto the Kegel type exercises, and you can think about things of visualization. That's what I do with my clients because they respond the best to this sort of work. So I get people to imagine their pelvic floor is a bit like a jellyfish. So let's imagine you got a jellyfish and it swoops up slowly, but then it also lets go, and then it swoops up again. Now the best thing about this is that it encourages people to hold on for longer. So I had a lady come to me, her pelvic floor was a good 80% strength. Then I got her to actually think about the jellyfish analogy, and when she did her pulling up, she then held for longer, and she became much stronger just by visualizing it in a different way. Another thing you can do is imagining that your pelvis or your vagina is like an elephant's trunk. Okay, and we can imagine that elephant's trunk coming down to a big ball, maybe like a football, and we can work our way down to like a golf ball. So if we imagine your elephant's trunk is sitting on a football and you're sucking up, like an elephant would, sucking up that football. And again, then you can make it smaller, going down to like a golf ball. So these visualizations take a bit of time, but the jellyfish one I find the most effective. But the elephant's trunk is just another way of visualizing this exercise. If you're really struggling, it is important to go and see a women's health specialist or someone that deals with the pelvic floor so that they can give you specific exercises for your issue. They can also tell you what's going on inside. If you want to feel yourself, what you can do is here's your pelvis, here's the front and here's the back. Here you have your vagina and then you have your anus. And in between is what we call the perineum. If you place your finger here when you're sitting on it, when you do a pelvic floor lift, you should feel this section lift from your finger. This will indicate to you if your pelvic floor is activating. So this is a really nice way of feeling that beginning process of a pelvic floor activation. Because the pelvic floor works alongside your tummy muscles, the deep back muscles, and most importantly the diaphragm, it's kind of the top of the cylinder, it works in tandem with the pelvic floor. So for this reason, when you do a pelvic floor exercise or a lift, you want to breathe out on the contraction. So let's take that jellyfish analogy. As you breathe in, and as you breathe out, then the jellyfish comes up. So you breathe out because then your diaphragm domes upwards, pushing the air out of your lungs. This allows your bowels to come in and up, and then your pelvic floor muscles to come up. If you were to breath hold or breathe in, where does your diaphragm go? It goes down to allow the lung space to fill. And if the diaphragm goes down, where do your bowels go? Where do your organs go? They also go down. They push down on the pelvic floor and they push out into the abdomen. this puts more greater pressure on the pelvic floor. So to contract against that, whilst everything is coming down, just doesn't make sense. So when you're breathing out, when you're doing an action, I'm going to pick up baby, you blow outwards. You breathe out and then you draw up. So we've talked about the pelvic floor exercises for if the pelvic floor muscles are just weak and they're not really firing so well. But we haven't talked about if the pelvic floor muscles are tight and therefore weak, or hypertonic, as we like to call them, or overactive. And basically what it means is that those pelvic floor muscles are at a tight resting tone. So when they should be relaxing, they should be at rest, they're actually tight like this. And so there are exercises to do for them too. And actually a lot of people can be this way, and sometimes they can have one side of their pelvic floors tight and the other side's okay. And those tension points can actually cause a weakness in the pelvic floor. So when someone's pelvic floor is weak, it's important to actually have a look and not just give Kegel exercises willy-nilly, because if you give Kegel exercises on top of a pelvic floor that's tight but weak, then all you're going to do is encourage it to get tighter and tighter and tighter. So some of the things that you'd like to do for that would be more release techniques. So some of the things you can do at home include sitting on like a Pilates ball or like a round soft ball. Now you want to put this around this perineum area, so between the vagina and the anus. You rest the ball there. You can slowly lower yourself down so you're in control, so that you have something where your hands can prop you up. And then you slowly just relax onto that ball. This will then lengthen those muscles over that ball, so effectively stretching them to give them more range. Then you can add in tilting your pelvis forwards, backwards, side to side. As we discussed, those muscles go from front to back and side to side. So it's important to include those into the release. Now when you're sitting on that ball, you may find that one side actually feels tighter. So that's fine. Just go with that feeling and note how it feels as you continue with the release. Then if you want to, you can make the ball either bigger if you find that a smaller one is too uncomfortable, or you can make the ball smaller to get more specific into the release. But having a medium-sized ball would do a good range of the pelvic floor. Then we can move on to actually the muscles that surround the pelvic floor. So if these muscles haven't been looking after you so well, or they've been weak, then the surrounding muscles will go, hey, I better do some work here and look after the situation. So part of the bum muscles, piriformis, you may have heard of that one, is one of the deep bum muscles. And actually, if you look into this picture here, you can see up on the top here, piriformis. So he almost merges into those pelvic floor muscles. So stretching out those particular muscles can make a real difference to how your pelvic floor functions again. Loosen them off, it gives opportunity for the other muscles to wake up again. The same with the inner thigh muscles. So the ones that come down the inner thighs of your legs, they're called the adductors. Again, if you stretch those, you loosen those, that will loosen the connective tissue that comes up and through into the pelvic floor again. So loosening all of those things can really help to actually strengthen your pelvic floor. And one final thing you can do is sitting into like a child pose, where you bring your knees apart and then you lower your front half down. And then you breathe into the belly, visualizing that you're lengthening your pelvic floor, that you're letting go in that region. And then one more after that you can do is going into a deep squat. So a deep squat down onto your heels. If you can't get your heels down, you can roll up a towel so that your heels can sit on the towel. But as long as your knees are wide apart, you can then rest your top half on something. And again, breathe into your belly and allow gravity to let your muscles lengthen and descend. And we'll do another video on this, on running through the actual process of those exercises for you.